guys can hear me now. So Thomas currently leads corporate HR and is a business partner for the enterprise HR shared services at Chewy. In this role, he has a lot of responsibility in working with executives across various departments, including Chewy's merchandising, healthcare, proprietary brands. He's passionate about entrepreneurship, holds a BA in Spanish, so is in a good place in Miami. And also, I have to say, for those of you who don't know, Chewy, they sell things for pets. And one of our students, Monica Tai, is currently there, and I really appreciated one of her presentations in my class about bringing your dog to work. Also joined today by my colleague, Ravi Gajendran. Ravi will certainly give himself a longer introduction at some point, I hope, but he has a PhD from Penn State University in organizational behavior. He is currently the Alvin Chapman Eminent Scholar at FIU and our Global Leadership and Management Department. He studies teams, impact of communications technology and leadership. He's on the editorial board for the Journal of Applied Linguistics, Personnel Psychology, and the Journal of Management. And his research has been featured in the Harvard Business Review. So it's so great for us to have him as a colleague. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, as people were entering the room, Ravi has focused a lot of his time on research in the area of remote work. And so today what we want to talk about is sort of lessons learned from our experience with this sort of accelerated experience with initially remote work, and now as we're moving on towards perhaps some hybrid work situations. I want to sort of lead by asking Thomas, exactly, how Chewy initially adapted to the pandemic, and to what extent you were perhaps already working on some hybrid remote work relationships, how the pandemic has accelerated this, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, that sounds great, Mark. First of all, good morning to everyone, I guess early afternoon. And I'm so excited to be here, by the way, today. This is a real topic for a lot of us the last 18 months. And I was kind of sort of joking before we came into the call today. In essence, we've kind of had an 18-month case study here since the start of the pandemic, and thinking about remote work and hybrid work, and sort of all the different lessons learned along the way. So just such a great and a timely topic. I'm excited to be here. I'll give you just a quick introduction, and then I'll jump into answering the question a little bit from Mark. I've been actually with Chewy now just coming up on 3 years. And for those of you that aren't as familiar with Chewy, we really focus our mission on being the most trusted and convenient destination for pet parents and partners everywhere. And regardless of, for those of you that own pets, it is a journey. There's highs and there's lows and there's everything in between. And Chewy likes to think of ourselves as being that one place you go to, regardless of what kind of piece in the journey you are. And obviously we have different products and services, whether it's our private brands, our healthcare business, et cetera, that we've intentionally built to service our customers there and provide them with a wow experience. And I mentioned that too in my introduction, because we've tried to flip that a little bit and think about what does that mean for us internally, for our team members, as we call them, Chutopians, for our actual employees. How do we provide the same experience to them in the midst of a lot of uncertainty, right? Which has been sort of the last 18 months that we've been in with the pandemic, and figuring out how to manage work. And I'll share a couple of highlights on how we've thought about it at Chewy to Mark's question, and then I'm happy to go deeper into any of those specific areas. But one of the things we did very early on was say, how do we stay true to who we are as an organization and what we believe in the midst of this uncertainty. And we saw a lot of our team members having to navigate through the pandemic and what work meant in light of that, how they approached work, how they thought about work, and then managed everything else in between. So one thing we did was to say, hey, let's stay true to who we are as an organization And we kind of grounded our remote work strategy on 3 tenets. The first one was a direct tie into our operating principles, which for Chewy is really our lifeblood. It defines who we are, how we think about things as an organization. And 2 of those operating principles for us, one of them is keep it simple, and the other one is act as an owner. And we really thought about how do we stay true to that as we think about managing through a remote work setting. The second one was thinking about how do we inspire our team members to do their best work and to still be able to build strong relationships and foster collaboration in the midst of a remote work environment. And we kind of took the philosophy of saying, it's better to approach this sort of inspire through a carrot versus police with a stick, right? In other words, providing an atmosphere that enables people to do their best work and acknowledging that may look differently for our different work segments. And then finally, we really wanted to ground on thinking to the future. We know we've obviously seen a lot of changes, not just in the work environment, but just the world around us throughout the last 18 months. And how do we get out in front of that? One, from a competitiveness standpoint, right? We know that other companies in the industry are certainly giving more flexibility and more permanent remote work options than what has been there previously, and are using that. I'm sure some of you like me have gotten the sort of the pings from LinkedIn. We're in the title line, right? The first thing in there is permanently remote work, right? So how do you stay true to who you are? And at Chewy, we believe that face-to-face collaboration is critical for innovation and relationship building and problem solving. So how do we maintain that, but at the same time still stay competitive? So we've kind of had an office of the future, if you will, tenet that we've been thinking about as we've navigated through this. And again, I'm happy to dive in more deeply into any of those areas and talk about where we ended up. But high level, Mark, to answer your question, that's kind of how we've been thinking about managing our workforce through this environment.
Good. Well, I am actually going to press you a little bit. So tell us what remote or hybrid work arrangements look like right now. Do you have a hybrid work arrangement? And if so, are all employees eligible?
Yes. Yeah. So it's interesting. We have a couple different options that we've deployed. First of all, we divide Chewy up essentially into 3 kind of primary business units. We have our fulfillment center, our operations side of the house, which makes up a vast majority of our team members. So, right now Chewy's about 20,000 or so team members, and 75% of that, right, 75% of that is in the field, right, is in our fulfillment centers. And so first of all, we had to think about how to manage through this environment and still continue our operations side of the house. And for that specific group, we've gotten very crisp on preventative measures, enhanced cleaning, thinking about the work arrangement itself, and how we can have people in proximity, right, in that operation setting, but still think about keeping our team members safe. So that piece of the house has been focused very much on safety, reliability. How do we help our team members feel comfortable to be able to come in and work in this environment? Similar, our second business in our customer service side of the house, similar where, we have a number of team members who work in a call center setting, right? A lot of proximity right next to each other. And we made the decision early on to be a little bit disruptive, if you will, in this area, and decided to allow our call center team members to work remotely from home. And, for those of you that have done studies around call center environments, there's a lot of conflicting data out there, right, around what's the optimal setting from a productivity standpoint in the call center setting. And, we obviously looked at that as a company, but had a really healthy debate around, look, we want to give our team members that flexibility during this time of uncertainty. Let's lean in and be disruptive. And it's been a great success for us. So, we've allowed a majority of our call center team members to work permanently remote through this uncertainty time. And then finally, our headquarters, kind of our third, business unit, which really encompasses a number of things for us. It's everything from marketing to merchandising to healthcare to kind of your standard SG&A groups, finance, HR, et cetera. There we went on a sort of a temporary kind of remote setting and plan to return in a phased kind of approach where we bring in some of our senior leaders first and then bring in our general population later. And we actually just pushed that back. Actually, we were going to start that phasing in September, but after just looking at the environment and what was going on with Delta variant and some of that, we made the decision to push back a little bit. But ultimately, when we return in our headquarters setting, we'll move to a permanent 3-2 hybrid schedule where our team members work in the office 3 days a week and then have the flexibility to work from home 2 days a week. And the sort of background behind that piece, right, came out of a lot of learning, right, as we went through the last 18 months, both positive and constructive, right? You know, on the positive side, when we went into a remote setting in our headquarters groups, we saw a big uptick in productivity initially, an excitement, a little bit of euphoria, right, for a lot of people who hadn't been in that environment ever in their career or, you know, hadn't done it for a while, right? It wasn't a previous option that we had at Chewy. And then, of course, as time goes along, right, especially now that we've had a lot of reopening, specifically in the US, where, you know, people weren't sort of at home all day and really couldn't do anything but focus on work. Right now that there's a lot of reopening, life is starting up, you know, kids are going back to school, there's some different macroeconomic things going on there. You know, now all of a sudden it's, okay, how do I balance, right, the commitments I was sort of undertaking previously with, you know, sort of the work environment and where we are there. And we've had to get really crisp around what does good leadership behavior look like in that environment? You know, what are sort of the methods and the mechanisms we want to put in place to help our team members stay connected until that point in time when we do return into the office. So anyway, a couple examples, Mark.
Yeah, great. So, you know, because in this particularly tight labor market, I could see a lot of employers maybe going too quickly into offering employees entirely remote opportunities because during a pandemic, this might seem real attractive, or if they don't have flexibility in their own work site, you know, that might be a draw. But as you note, and as Marissa Meyer noted, when she called Yahoo employees back from remote work arrangements, you know, you lose something in terms of that innovation. Ravi, I was wondering, you know, what does the research have to say about, you know, the optimal mix in trying to balance both flexibility, but the need for the organization to have people together, because, you know, that seems to be the way that we innovate.
Yeah, so, you know, I'm just going to step back a little bit, give a little bit of background before I answer that specific question. So we've had remote work, you know, in the US for a long, long time, and it's been growing steadily over time. And so one of the research papers that I published was a meta-analysis. So meta-analysis essentially looks at all the research in the field and quantitatively synthesizes them. And what we find in that meta-analysis is that telecommuting has largely beneficial effects and very little downside. If you reverse, you know, if you go back a few years ago, there was a big debate about telecommuting. You know, are people going to slack off? You know, are people going to feel isolated? Are people going to, is there going to be large downsides to doing this? And so one of the things that people were concerned about is relationships will suffer, and your relationship with your boss will suffer, will be less productive. So those were some of the concerns, and most viewed telecommuting or remote work as sort of a family-friendly arrangement, right? So a flexible work arrangement. And so remote work was largely discussed as an HR sort of benefit or perquisite, so to speak. But with the pandemic, what's happened is there's been a large-scale shift in the conversation. For the first time, you have people in the boardroom actually talking about remote work. This never happened before, right? And so there's a paradigm shift in terms of who is interested in remote work and what's the argument around remote work. So now people are making arguments around a business case for it, productivity, they're talking about real estate cost reduction. So the whole paradigm or the discussion around remote work has shifted. And in that context, it's interesting to see that my meta-analysis, which happened way back in 2007, many of those findings still remain relevant and are actually, relevant to addressing the sweet spot question of how much remote work versus how much, in-office work. In that meta-analysis, we find that, telecommuting does a lot of good things, modestly so, small effects, nothing, extraordinary. It improves productivity, it improves, work-family balance, it reduces stress, it improves job satisfaction, and it leads to autonomy. And what we find is the mechanism through which all these effects come about is autonomy. When people work from home, they have flexibility, and that flexibility, people value that flexibility, that autonomy a lot, and that's what transmits its benefits to all the good stuff that happens. There's only one downside that we note from this meta-analysis, and that is if you're working from home or you're working remotely more than 2.5 days a week, so around 50% of the time, if you go over that, relationships with coworkers suffer. And I suspect, that's going to be sort of the sweet spot around, between 2 to 3 days at least in office and 2 to 3 days at home, and no more on either side. That's the balancing point. In fact, I was talking to a senior executive at Procter & Gamble, and they had different, units go off and say, okay, how do you want to structure your in-office versus remote presence? They too came back with exactly the same sort of sweet spot. So I think there is something about that 3-2, which Thomas was mentioning that Chewy is going to adopt, that there's going to be a balance of being in office versus being at home that's going to optimize a number of different outcomes that are of importance to the employee.
I was wondering if there's any research, and Thomas, you could address this in terms of whether your executive team discusses as to whether there's value in having a 3-2, but everybody's in the office, for instance, on Wednesday, or everybody's in the office on a given day a week. Has that been looked at in the literature? And I'm, go that first to you, Ravi, and then I'll go to Thomas as to whether you guys were discussing that internally.
So that's a great question, and it speaks, and the short answer is no, but it speaks to an interesting trade-off that organizations face, right? So the more employees get to decide when they come into work and how often they come into work, the more employees experience autonomy, and so some of those benefits that come about, are going to be enhanced. On the other hand, the more organizations rely on teams, the more control organizations want over when employees show up at office and what they do when they show up at office, right? And so that reduces employee autonomy to some extent, and so it's a trade-off there. You can let the decision-making rest with the employee, or organizations can mandate, right? So for example, I think Apple mandates that you have to be in office Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, or something like that. So where that decision-making lies is an interesting balance, and that may depend on the specific business unit and what they do. It may depend on some kind of negotiation between the unit and the larger organization. I suspect the answer is going to lie at the team level. We don't want a top-down senior manager saying it's going to be you all show up on Wednesday. At the same time, you don't want employees completely deciding that I'm going to show up when I want. You want it somewhere in between, and the team level, or the work group level is where that decision has to be made that optimizes both coordination needs and autonomy needs. Let me turn it over to Thomas, because I'm talking theory. He's got the actual practical insight there.
Yeah, no, Ravi, it's interesting, Ravi, because ironically, that's exactly where we've landed. And a little bit on the journey to get there for us, one of the things we did really early on was form a return to work committee. And in addition to obviously looking at policies, procedures, mechanisms, things we needed to deal with based on what was evolving in the pandemic, it also gave us an opportunity to have some great debate, right? And to look at some benchmark data and get a sense for what other companies were doing and thinking about. So we actually had 40 companies that we were benchmarking in real time as things have evolved over the last 18 months. And wanted to see obviously what kind of ideas and thoughts were out there, but for companies that jumped earlier right into this, learn what they actually were seeing and what they learned along the way, right? And obviously use those learnings to make a decision. And we did that and saw some very interesting things and ideas out there, right? And I think we all saw there were some companies very early on that just said, we're going to move permanently remote. We're going to remove our kind of real estate footprint and are going that direction. Others were much more conservative on the other side and really pushed to get back sooner. But where we landed on this specific topic was, the more, and it's funny because we had the debate on both sides. Did we want to have some type of a fixed kind of rigid schedule in place? And we even got down to the level of saying, does Department A need to be in the office at the same time as Department B to enable outcome C, right? And the more we got into that logistical sort of, kind of question, it got complex very quickly. And it also started becoming obvious that it's not necessarily the case, right, that every department needs to be in the office at the same time as another department. There may be key players that collaborate and correspond, but looking at it at that macro of a level started to not make sense, right, as we really kind of pushed and poked holes in that a little bit more. And so where we ended up landing ultimately was saying, again, kind of back to our sort of tenets early on that we established, thinking how to give the right amount of flexibility and autonomy. We said, hey, let's have individual leaders for their work teams have the conversation with their team members and make a decision on what makes sense, obviously, from a business standpoint, but also from a team member standpoint, and find that balance. And rather, than try to have some, sort of forced kind of approach to that, give that leader the ability to make a decision for their specific work team. And then the other thing that we've done too is said, hey, there absolutely will be times when we want to have people come in collectively. Maybe it's for a town hall meeting or some type of an on-site event where we're talking about business planning for the following year. So, it's sort of a given, right? There may be certain points along the way we want that holistic team in. But in terms of managing forward, leaving that decision point with our leaders of their specific work groups and allowing them to manage that with their team members. The last thing I'll say specifically from an HR standpoint here, right, is, what role, right, does HR play in all of this moving forward, right? Because you start thinking about putting in a lot of rigid mechanisms. Then the question is, who's gonna hold the accountability? Who's gonna follow up, right? And at least at Chewy, specifically on our HR business partner side of the house, we really avoid trying to create a police force, right? That's not where we see the value of the role or where we want people to have, where they're spending their time. Instead, let's put the accountability in our leaders, let them make the right decisions for their work teams and collaborate with their individual team members and give the flexibility there.
Yeah, now Ravi will be able to speak to this perhaps both as a researcher and a practitioner, because I'm wondering how managing hybrid work environments will change from managing a traditional environment. Now, this is way outside my area of specialization, so I don't know whether or not Thomas, your organizations has looked at this and has begun to develop some leadership training around having a new workforce, and Ravi, whether your personal experience managing a bunch of faculty has given you any insight, or whether or not the research is beginning to develop in this area. We'll start with Ravi, I guess.
Okay, so I think one of the issues is, it is important to create equity among two types of workforces, maybe even three types of workforces, right? So you're going to have some people who say, I'm going to show up in office all days a week, right? Are you going to tell them, no, don't show up? How is that going to work? What about the folks who are working hybrid, right? They show up some days a week, they're away other days a week. And then you have people who are permanently remote, right? How do you create a sense of equity? Because we do know that face time matters, right? So we do know that if I show up in office and I'm there a lot of the time, the challenging assignments are going to come my way. There's just a bias, and I'm doing some research on this. There is a bias towards people who you see more often, right? Regardless of how hard they work. Oftentimes, in the past, performance appraisal was based on, do I see you every day in office? Do I see you working weekends? Do I see you working late? Because often when you're doing complex knowledge work, it's really hard to figure out what is your individual contribution to this larger effort. And I'm going to use these non-relevant indicators like presence in office to give you a promotion or to treat you as, a high potential. And to be able to go away from that to something which is more based on what is it that you're delivering to the organization requires very sophisticated levels of management, right? Especially if you're working in a team-based environment, it's not easy to separate out who does what. And especially if you have a permanent remote or a hybrid workforce, it becomes really important to figure out how do you recognize individual contributions when you can't see people contributing because they're working remotely, right? That's a huge challenge, right? And how do you make sure that inadvertently you don't divert all the challenging assignments to people who are in office because they just seem to come to mind when that assignment comes to you, right? And so those are the sort of fairness or equity issues that are critical to deal with. Otherwise, you're going to have like a 2 or 3 tier workforce where some people are favored over the others, and then then those folks who are permanently remote are going to go to organizations that are better able to manage remote workforces in a fair and equitable manner. Thomas?
So Thomas, yeah, so has your organization sort of discussed this issue and developed leadership training based on it?
Yes, yeah. So a couple learnings and a couple of specific programs we've put in place. It was interesting, kind of taking us back in history a little bit. Again, initially, kind of this move to a remote work environment came with a lot of euphoria. And as time started to go on, it was interesting, specifically in the HR business partner side of our organization, we started to hear from leaders, requests around, hey, this managing in a remote environment is becoming relevant. Some of the things I used to rely on to manage my team and help think about development of my team, et cetera, have just fundamentally changed. I need some guidance. I want to get some idea generation going right on how can I do this more effectively. And I know even personally, right, one of the early leaders I reported to early in my career used to be that leader who, when they were going to get on a phone call with somebody that was way above my pay grade, right, would pull me into the office just to listen to that phone conversation, right? There was that kind of organic development and growth that you could have by sort of that face-to-face impact and collaboration or just opportunities. So how do you duplicate that, right, in the remote environment, just as one example? Our big learning, not to oversimplify, but is, leadership kind of essentials and mechanics are so important, right? And, so some of the basics, right, that a lot of times we take for granted, we found become even more relevant in a remote environment. An example of that would be clear performance goals, making sure there's frequent and robust checkpoints, one-on-ones, right? Not just sort of flying through the standards, but being deliberate about that and how you think about that when you go through a one-on-one conversation in this environment. Thinking about what the mechanisms we have in place organizationally from a performance evaluation standpoint or a talent review standpoint. So we literally, took that to the drawing board and said, how do we make sure there's a consistency thread on how we think about performance in the organization and help our leaders be aligned to that, right, as we come into a performance cycle. Same thing around leadership development or just development in general for our team members. We rolled out a number of resources specifically geared toward our leaders on managing in this environment, thinking about development of team members. And then the last thing I'll mention too is thinking about movement, right, in a remote environment, which is a little bit, it almost sounds counterintuitive, right? But in terms of a career standpoint, opportunity-wise, how do we still make sure that internal mobility is a priority, right? It's a little bit easier sometimes when you don't see that person face-to-face every day, or you have some of those sort of hallway conversations that you can cover in 5 minutes, and now you're getting into a meeting and you're spending 30 minutes there, and it isn't always tailored to that, right? So how do we think about internal mobility even in the midst of a remote environment? And for Chewy, we were very fortunate during the pandemic, right? We saw our business explode, and we could not hire fast enough. Interestingly enough, was our challenge. So the other side of this for us was onboarding, right? We're first time we're actually onboarding a majority of our individuals in a remote setting. How do we put some processes and mechanisms in place there to ensure a consistent and reliable experience. So again, we worked with our various teams to put in some new programs and processes and a specific onboarding program that helps integrate people in a different way and form instant connections, which is we found is a bit more challenging right in the remote environment. So anyway, a couple practical examples of what we've done.
Sure. Can I just ask you a little bit deeper on that? So
Sure.
What were some of the ideas that you came up with in this process, right? You had to sort of think on your feet there, right? You're onboarding employees in an environment you never thought you would have to. What are some of the things that you did differently and that you learned from that experience?
Absolutely. So one example is thinking about engagement, right? So you have onboarding, right? And then you have sort of what happens after that, right? And rather than kind of leaving that up to chance, we put in place a couple new programs at Chewy. One is called Life at Chewy. And it's it's 100% focused on connecting Chewtopians who are either joining or have been with us for a while, right? And it includes things like relationship building, social, and how you use that to keep team members connected. Community service, what are some of the things we're doing as a company and how can we bring team members together in that setting? Really beefing up our employee resource groups and thinking about how we focus on D&I during this time period. We put different clubs in place for people to be able to connect. So maybe you're like me and I'm a little too obsessed with guitars. I'm a big Taylor acoustic guitar guy. We put different clubs if you're a musician or if you have a sport interest. So again, a lot of tailored effort on how do we keep people connected and able to build those relationships in this setting. And then we also formed what's called Grow at Chewy. So, it's interesting, right? Because a lot of times, and I'm a big believer of this, we hear, as you think about development and team member development, individuals sort of own their career and their development. And while there's absolutely truth to that, right? We also wanted to make sure people were able to understand what that meant in a Chewy context, right? So whether it was thinking about a learning and development opportunity or activity, or what critical skill sets or competencies were needed in certain roles, or to be able to think about roles at the next level, or perhaps a lateral move into another department. We really doubled down on providing those resources in an easy to access manner. It became part of sort of that onboarding process. People were exposed, they had a chance to walk through that with their leader and continue an ongoing dialogue there. So a couple of examples, Mark, on some specific things we did.
No, that's really great, and it just shows that these things don't just happen. They,
right.
Organizations, management, human resource departments have an ability to get ahead of this and really think thoughtfully about how to move forward rather than just sort of let things happen. We have some questions from our audience now in our chat window. So first one's for you, Thomas, and it's sort of asking you what kind of feedback you've received from employees who are opposed to hybrid schedules or are opposed to going back, and how you're reconciling the various ideas on this.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a good, let's bring us back to reality question too, right? We can hypothetically talk about the greatness of a 3-2 schedule, but there always are people that have different preferences, right? Whether that's permanently remote, or on the flip side, it's so funny, Mark, when you said people that want to come in and work 5 days a week. We've got those individuals too saying, I don't want a hybrid schedule, I want to work 5 days a week. So regardless of what side of the spectrum you're on, there's a couple things that we've done, to sort of address that feedback. One is we've put in some pulsing mechanisms that's largely administered by our HR business partner organization as part of their standard checkpoints that are intentionally asking questions around the return to work environment, employee sentiment and opinion on that. And then we collectively take that feedback and share that with our senior leadership. And that's given us the ability to address it in a variety of forums, right? Maybe it's during a town hall meeting for a certain department. Maybe it's an all hands meeting company-wide where we're able to say, hey, here's the feedback that we've heard. Here's how we're thinking about this as a company and what we plan to do moving forward. So there's kind of that closure to that feedback loop as well. The other thing that we've done is, I'm going to say be open-minded too, right? We've said, hey, we're all going through this together. We want to hear opinions, we want to hear ideas, and we want to give people the forum to do that. So whether it's through that pulsing mechanism, we have kind of our standard engagement survey. We've sent out in like a focused return to work survey as well, just to make sure we keep that pulse and that conversation going. And our leaders have done a really good job of being open and transparent about what we're thinking about, how we plan to proceed. And there's literally a weekly communication on how has our thinking evolved or what have we learned, so that it's in the forefront, right? It doesn't feel like we've kind of said it and then sort of, kind of swept it under the rug and are moving on. So just a lot of transparency, a lot of openness, a lot of communication. And that's kind of how we've managed it.
Yeah, and and that transparency helps address some of the equity issues. People
Yes.
need to know what's going on, otherwise they might just presume things aren't there and such. Ravi, the next question I'll sort of send over to you because it references a Journal of Applied Psychology study relating to cameras on, and I suspect there's going to be a theme related to autonomy here. But the basic question is, there is some discussion as to whether or not you should have mandated camera on policies during meetings and such. So just was wondering your thoughts on this.
So first, to Marissa, who asked the question, I'm really impressed that you looked up that you did read up about this Journal of Applied Psychology study. So that's, if you were in my class, I would give you extra credit for that. So there's some research, on this issue of whether we should mandate camera on. And again, as Mark already, astutely observed, it's about people's autonomy, right? If you trust people, then you let them decide if they want to keep their cameras on or off. And mandating cameras on is like mandating that, you have to gather at the water cooler for 5 minutes every day to make social chit chat with your coworkers, right? I mean, people have different ways in which they process information during a meeting, and letting people figure out whether they would rather be on screen or off screen, but still participating in the meeting is a choice that, I think leaders should provide. And it goes back to, something that Thomas said earlier. If you expect employees to act like owners, right? If you expect them to think like owners and you expect them to take ownership and responsibility, then, mandating camera on kind of defeats that very principle, because it says that, look, I don't trust you enough to not, slack off when you have the camera off, right? So I think it part of it boils down to why are they mandating cameras on? So it might make sense to do that if the team is meeting for the first time and you want to have some introductions going. So you can say, okay, let's have cameras on, everybody, so we can see each other. You can do that for the 5-10 minutes, and then you can say you can do whatever, right? You want to keep your cameras on, keep it on, leave it off if you want. But mandating that could be, it could consume sort of mental resources for people who are not as comfortable having the camera on them all the time. And remember, when you're working from home and you're on Zoom, you're in a different mindset than you're in the office, right? So you could be wearing shorts, like, I am wearing shorts right now, although I have like a formal shirt. And so, if you want to move up, if you want to go and grab coffee or something, and you want to get up and you don't want people to see that you're in shorts, that might, ruin some of it. So it's about control. It's about trusting employees. And if you do that, there's no need to mandate, these things. These will organically emerge in the group as to what the norms are and how we can work with one another to be effective, regardless of the camera on or off. And in this context, we do have some research. And what we're finding is when working on creative tasks, it is better to be, even if you're on Zoom, and you're doing this with cameras off and audio, you're more creative than if you have cameras on and you're trying to brainstorm. But that's in the works, and I can talk about that more later.
Well, that's really interesting. So I'm going to follow that up by bundling a few questions for Thomas together. So, and so there's sort of some discussion here about are there sort of technologies that are and the appropriate use of technology? Because one challenge is when you're working remotely, it tends to your work day and your home day do become blended, and it's easy to be overwhelmed. And then related to this is the question of performance appraisal. But why don't we leave performance appraisal for really a separate question that will follow up? And so, are there technologies or recommendations that you're making from the use of technologies and providing time for people to have some, focus time on task and such?
Yes. Yeah. It's a great question, because one of the things I know that I've personally noticed with my different teams is, in this environment, people do have different work days, times, hours that they're working, right? And as a consequence to that, you typically do see the flood of emails or messages hit all the time, right? It could be 2 o'clock in the morning, or it could be during this kind of the standard day. And it's interesting because it's not necessarily right that people are just all working until 2 o'clock in the morning, right? That could be a very personal decision based on someone managing through this environment. So one of the things that I've really talked about with the leaders that I support is, you kind of have, you establish that precedent a bit, right, with your own team. So I'm going to talk to the leaders specifically first here, right? And then I'll talk more holistically. But personally, I'm very cognizant of when I send an email right now, right, to a team member, because just like everybody else, I'm working some different hours than I would have done back in the days when we all were in the office. Remember those days? And so I'm just very cognizant of, it's very easy to just put a delay on that email or shoot it out the next morning. And if I send it at 7 or whatever I'm working, there's that elicits a response, right, from somebody. And some people can ignore it and be fine, and other people feel like I got to pick that up and do something with it. So I think back to that leadership fundamentals comment I made earlier today, leadership behaviors, right, through this really do matter. And I think can help to make it an environment where people, again, feel like they have flexibility versus a burden to have to always respond or always be connected, and to try to find some balance there, right? A little more tangibly in how we've managed at Chewy, we've deployed a couple different technology platforms to help us there. One is we've deployed Slack, for those of you that are familiar with that. What I use Slack for, I use it for a couple of different things, and I see a lot of leaders do the same thing at Chewy. One is it gives us a commonality platform for the team to be able to collaborate. So when somebody has that random question or can't remember the response or how somebody handled something, it's a really easy way just to ping out there and get a general response versus feeling like I've got to send something to a single person every single time. So it allows for kind of more of that team collaboration. And then obviously it gives you the one-on-one sort of opportunity too. So I use it as a way, to stay up to speed on items that aren't as urgent. Sometimes we use it as a way to kind of share ideas, collaborate on just some challenges that we're facing. And as people have time, they can go in and share their 2 cents and collaborate that way. And then we actually, Chewy uses Zoom, interesting enough, as our platform from a meeting platform. And it's funny too, because we've been careful not to mandate certain Zoom use policies for the exact reasons that Ravi was sharing earlier. And I'll admit, a leadership moment for me was, I'm the person that even if everybody else has their camera off, I'll have it on. And one day, somebody pointed out to me, look, that again, that sets a precedent, right? Like, think about what that means and how you manifest that. And we had a good laugh about it, right? And like, what really was the intent right there and the expectation. So again, back to kind of that openness and transparency, we've encouraged leaders, hey, let's talk about that as a team. There might be times we want that, we don't want that. But let's think about back to kind of our flexibility kind of tenet again. So anyway, those are a couple different platforms we've used to kind of manage through the remote environment.
I'm sorry, I want to come back to this sort of theme of equity because it relates to performance appraisal as well. Because, at the end of the day, an employee should know what the task is so that when appraisal time comes, there could be clear understanding. And the way I'll contextualize this is the way I think Ravi alluded to earlier. At the university, there have been some discussions about having permanent remote faculty. And I think those of us who aren't going to be permanent remote faculty have concerns that there's going to be an extra burden of work that naturally falls on those who are not permanent. And so I don't know if there are emerging best practices yet, or Ravi, you have some thoughts about, how to, is it possible, I suppose, to have permanently remote workers together with hybrid workers, together with fully face-to-face workers, and have, be able to balance equity concerns?
I think part of it lies on, I suppose it depends on the kinds of tasks these different employees perform. So there are some employees who are more core compared to others. And there are some, team tasks that can be done remotely better than, even in person perhaps. So for example, software development, a lot of it can be done remotely and done very well remotely. But if you're working on a creative task, like a brainstorming for an advertising campaign, or you're working in marketing, a permanent remote may not be very helpful. So it's going to be that some teams are going to, because of the nature of their tasks, they're going to be hybrid. I think today, for the most part, most teams don't have to be full-time in office unless there's some security concern or something like that. I think most teams can be hybrid and still get their job done. But the question is, between hybrid and permanent remote, it depends on the kind of tasks they do and the kind of importance those tasks have for the organization. So at a surface level, that could create sort of equity differences, because you naturally want the teams that are more core to be more, closer to the organization, in some sense, almost hybrid, therefore, because you do want that face-to-face contact. The less central teams can be fully remote. And so as a result, there's going to be some natural sort of favoring of one over the other. And whether that favoring is equitable or not is a very tricky question to answer, right? Because are they being favorably treated because they deliver more value to the organization in some sense, or are they being favorably treated just because they're seen more often? And that's a very tricky question to answer. And I think it goes back to the core DNA of the organization and its culture about, whether they prioritize fairness as an important sort of value. If they do, then I believe that there will be sort of a natural sort of, equity that's generated there. Yet, because people are not seen, there could be some bias that's, not quite identified. So organizations, well, even fair organizations, even organizations that value fairness, have to be careful about understanding, when not being seen translates to not being rewarded and not being promoted, right? So, and this is, each organization has to find its own solution for this. There's no one size fits all for this.
Okay. Haifa Gonzalez from one of our current students, and also, I must say, a great student, has a question here. Now, it's really anticipating a future webinar, so Thomas, you don't have to get too into it, but maybe it's a teaser to get everybody back here in a couple of weeks. And that is, she's asking, whether or not you've been impacted by the Great Resignation, and to what extent your organization has made some adjustments for this.
Yeah. Oh man, this is a good. I was just gonna say, how much time we got left?
Right.
Yeah. No, well, look, the quick answer to the question is yes. It is, and the way, I'll be a little more specific. The way we've really seen that is competitiveness, right, has really ramped up, and in particular areas, right? So, for example, technical talent. Right now it was already a hot market, and now you add on some of the sort of macroeconomic pressures that are currently in play, and it has become ultra competitive, right? Or whatever the next level word is following that. So we've done a couple things to get out in front of this and to try to curtail it as much as we can. I'll be brief today, and then again, it's something I'm happy to double click in more offline too. But one is we've looked at the components you would typically think about, right, from a competitiveness standpoint, and it's everything from compensation to the type of work, the level of autonomy, the sort of types of experiences, sort of some of those kind of core fundamentals to some of these roles. And then secondly, we've taken an internal look, right, and said, how can we sort of peek around the corner, get the crystal ball out around where there may be risk isn't necessarily always the right word here, but where there's individuals who fall into categories that would be highly sought after, right, by other organizations, and developing interventions early on in partnership with our leaders to get out in front of that. So it's trying to be a bit predictive in nature, right, on where there's some potential risk areas or where we know there's going to be heavy competition for that talent, getting out in front of it and developing some action plans to curtail it. So we've really tried to think ahead a bit on that and make sure we're doing everything we can to think about retaining well, in addition to just hiring well in the organization. And by the way, it also ties right back to, I keep talking about our operating principles, but one of our operating principles is customer first. And to Ravi's point earlier, one of the sub bullets in there is talking about providing a consistent and reliable experience to our team members, right? And it's amazing how often that can either make or break someone's decision to stay or leave the organization. So we've really honed back in on some of our core fundamentals as an organization, and have made sure that we've got those like the sentiment analysis in place to be able to understand, hey, how are we doing in that area, and making sure we are staying consistent and reliable.
So my task here is to say, oh, we have a couple more questions, but we can't get to them today. But I would like to do one thing right now, sort of summarize a few main points. And this is where I want Thomas and Ravi to sort of chime in with some ideas. So one thing that seems clear to me is that this is something that requires intent. You just can't allow this to happen and see where the chips fall. And I'm really impressed how Chewy has gotten ahead of this by, obviously putting a lot of thought into this, looking at other organizations. Another key theme that seems important is valuing, and this is going to be particularly true in our knowledge economy, autonomy of the teams, of the individual workers, and trying to find that balance between, having management do what it needs to do to sort of corral energy and talent, but at the same time, recognize that that talent is going to be most effective when individuals have a lot of autonomy. And another thing that didn't come out, but certainly I think everybody would agree with, if you really want to have a successful hybrid workplace, you have to have a place where people want to come to work. And so Chewy's always done, I think, a really great job of really, encouraging people who want to come to work. I think of my institution, our institution, FIU, I think maybe there could be more things to encourage faculty to want to come on campus, maybe greater safety precautions. That's just my personal thought. So you have autonomy, the need to have intentionality in management, and this idea that you have to have a pleasant place to work. Other things that we might want to add, sort of just as a conclusion here? Oh, okay, there's silence. So that maybe we got it. Yes, Thomas.
Yeah, no, Mark. I was going to say, I think you hit the majors. The only other thing I would just throw in there is and it relates to one of your points, but I think flexibility is important. Back to the autonomy point, to a certain extent, but being able to sort of fail fast and iterate, right, and learn as you go through this. Because I wish I could tell you we've gotten everything right the first time around, but that certainly hasn't happened. And I think staying close to your employee population, listening to the feedback, the concerns, the comments, it doesn't necessarily mean you got to do everything people say you need to do, right? But it gives you an ability to understand the pulse and develop, sort of programs or initiatives that help you address what is on people's minds and stay out in front, right? So I think there's kind of that connection point there to have a good pulse on your employee population and know what's on their mind, and think about how you over communicate and be transparent around what you're thinking about organization.
Yes, that sounds great. Ravi, any last thoughts?
Yeah, so I think the other thing that is coming through from what Thomas is saying, and that becomes even more critical as we move to a hybrid and remote environment, is data-driven, evidence-based, ability to understand what's happening with your employees, right? Especially if you can't see your employees, if you can't talk to them on a day-to-day basis, infrastructure that allows them to capture their sentiments on an ongoing basis becomes even more critical.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Thomas, for joining us today. Thank you, Ravi, for finding time. Thanks to everyone for the questions. My apologies for not being able to get to all the questions. Keep an eye out for our next Is the Mic On webinar. We're planning one next month. And so hope to see you guys then. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Wonderful being here.